I've been a park ranger for 15 years. I worked most of that time in the Ponderosa forests of Arizona, but a few years ago, I headed back up north. My family's from Twin Falls, Idaho. My parents are getting older, so I wanted to be closer to check on them more often. I got a post at Craters of the Moon National Monument. I had a research position, so I was moving into a pretty remote station. It was quite a distance from the nearest town. After I moved in, it seemed like things kept going wrong. The solar power was glitchy and wasn't working half the time. My sleep was suffering from weird disturbances. There were a lot of species of bats there, which was fine, but they kept getting into my cabin somehow. I kept getting awakened by flapping and squeaking. I couldn't find how they were getting in. I lived in the middle of juniper and scraggly pine and sagebrush, and for some reason that landscape gave me an eerie feeling. It felt so different from the southwest Ponderosa forest that I was used to. About 2 months into the job, I started hearing something walking and scratching on the deck at night. Sometimes it even sounded like it was scratching on the door. The area was known for its wood rats, so I chalked it up to that. Whenever I went to check it out, nothing was there. I assumed they scurried away when I opened the door. Then I started finding these dismembered bats. Sometimes they were torn in half, but mostly I'd just find their wings on my deck. I've always been a relaxed person, so the fact that I was feeling so edgy was out of character for me. Whenever I'd leave the cabin at night, I had an eerie feeling like I was being watched. One night, I was getting back from my shopping run that I did once a week. While I was parking, I got a bad feeling. A mountain lion. But I wouldn't normally associate that scent with a big cat, so that seemed odd. I threw a piece of wood toward it, and it leaped back a bit, but it didn't make any sound. I threw 3 or 4 more pieces at it, and it retreated a little further back. At this point, I abandoned the groceries and started fumbling with my keys. I made a mad dash for the front door and managed to get inside. When I came out, the eyes looked a bit closer. I couldn't get a good look at it. It was out of range of the porch light. I had no real way to protect myself, so I kept throwing pieces of wood with one hand. Finally, the thing walked away into the brush. I waited for a good 10 or 15 minutes before I rushed to get my groceries and get back inside. I eventually calmed down enough to make dinner. I couldn't imagine what was attracting it to my deck. I kept the place clean and was obsessive about not having a trace of food around. A couple hours later, I was sitting at the table reading and I heard that scratching sound again. This time I could swear I also heard this low, growling sound. By then I was feeling like a nervous wreck. It felt like the thing was stalking me. I went to the window and raised the blinds about an inch and looked out. I assume it saw the movement because when I looked out, it had its back to me and was heading off the deck. I just froze when I saw a monster over 6 feet tall standing on 2 legs. It wasn't a cat at all. It looked like an upright canine creature with a humped back and massive shoulders. The legs almost looked human but were huge. The crew came up and we found huge tracks on the porch and leading away from the cabin. Huge canine tracks with long claws. After that night, I always thought I heard scratching on the deck but never found tracks. I was afraid I was losing it. As soon as possible, I got transferred to the main guard station where I could be around coworkers a lot of the time. But eventually, I convinced my parents to move to Arizona, and I went back to the park I was familiar with. I just couldn't take that kind of stress. So I've got a real crazy story to share. This isn't your typical campfire tale, but something that actually happened to me. It's kind of wild, too. It all started last summer. I'm an outdoorsy type, always hiking and camping when I can get away. So one weekend, I decided to explore this dense forest area a few hours from my place in Oregon. I'd heard rumors about it. Strange noises, weird sightings, the usual stuff you might hear about in remote places. I'm not superstitious, but I do love a good mystery. I packed up my gear tent, food, the basics, and headed out early. The drive was peaceful, just me and the open road. I arrived at the forest mid-morning. It was stunning, like something straight out of a nature documentary. It was weird, but I figured maybe I was making too much noise and scaring the animals away. I was munching on a sandwich when I heard it, a deep, guttural sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was distant, but clear enough to make me stop chewing. I looked around, thinking maybe there was another hiker or an animal nearby. But no, I was alone. I brushed it off and kept moving, but that sound, it stayed with me, echoing in my head. I reached the campsite by evening, set up my tent, and made a small fire. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake off a feeling of being watched. It was probably just the isolation getting to me, I told myself. Night fell, and the forest grew eerily quiet. I was lying in my tent trying to sleep when I heard footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate steps, crunching on the forest floor. My heart raced. I thought about yelling out, asking who was there, but something inside me said that was a bad idea. Then I saw its shape on the tent in the moonlight. It was looming outside my tent. It was huge, way bigger than any person or animal I knew. I held my breath, hoping whatever it was would just move on. But it stayed there, just outside my tent, for what felt like hours. Eventually, the presence faded away and didn't return, and the forest noises slowly returned when it disappeared. I didn't sleep a wink that night, my mind racing with questions. What was that thing? Why did it come so close to my tent? As soon as the sun rose, I stepped out of my tent. There was a heavy... That's when it hit me. Could it have been a Sasquatch? I mean, I'd always thought those stories were just tall tales. But there I was, looking at something I couldn't explain. It was real, whatever it was. I was torn between packing up and leaving or following those footprints to get some answers. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my gear and started following the trail. It led deeper into the forest, to areas where it seemed like no one had ever been. The footprints were clear at first, but then they started to get erratic, like whatever made them was running. I kept going, the forest growing denser and the air getting colder. And then I found something that stopped me in my tracks. I stood there, frozen, staring at what I'd just found. It was a clearing, but not just any clearing. In the middle, there was a sort of structure, like a nest made of large sticks and leaves. It was massive, easily big enough for something the size of what I saw last night. I edged closer, my curiosity overpowering my fear. The nest, or whatever it was, looked recently used. There were bits of fur and... was that fabric? Yeah, torn pieces of what looked like clothing that set off alarm bells in my head. Had someone else encountered this creature? Were they okay? I heard a noise behind me and spun around. Nothing. Just trees and the faint rustling of leaves. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it. I decided to take a few photos with my phone just to prove I wasn't losing my mind. As I turned back to the nest, something on the ground caught my eye. Every little noise made me jump. I felt like eyes were on me from every direction. I barely touched my dinner, my appetite totally gone. As night fell, I crawled into my tent, the camera clutched in my hand. I couldn't stop thinking about the nest, the camera, those footprints. What had I stumbled upon? I needed answers. I was so engrossed in my thoughts that I didn't hear the footsteps outside my tent at first. When I did, it was like déjà vu, only this time they were heavier, more purposeful. I froze, not daring to breathe. The footsteps circled my tent, then stopped right beside it. I could hear breathing, heavy and ragged. It was right there, just a thin layer of tent fabric between me and it. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, hoping it would just go away like last time. Then without warning, the creature let out a howl. It was mournful, almost human, but filled with a sorrow and depth that sent shivers down my spine. The sound echoed through the forest, hanging in the air long after it had stopped. The creature moved away from my tent, its footsteps fading into the distance. I lay there, wide awake, until the first light of dawn crept into the sky. As soon as it was light enough, I packed up my gear. I had to get out of there, had to get back to civilization. I had proof now, undeniable proof of what I'd seen. I started the hike back to my car, moving as fast as I could. My mind was racing with what I'd experienced, what I'd seen. Who would believe me? Did I even believe it myself? I reached my car by mid-morning, threw my gear in the back, and drove off. I didn't stop until I reached home. So there I was, back at home, safe but shaken. I couldn't get what happened out of my head. I started digging online, looking for anything about Sasquatch sightings in that area. That's when I stumbled upon a local news article from a few years back. It was about a hiker who'd gone missing in the same forest I'd just come from. They never found him. Could it be? Was it possible that this missing hiker had encountered the same creature? I sat there, staring at my computer screen, trying to process everything. Then I remembered the camera I'd found. The camera had to have belonged to the missing hiker. I needed to go to the police. They had to know about this. I packed up the camera and drove to the nearest police station. I told them everything: the sounds, the footprints, the nest, the camera. They listened, but I could tell they were skeptical. When I showed them the camera, though, their expressions changed. They told me they would need to keep it as evidence and that they would reopen the investigation. Days turned into weeks, and there was no news. I checked in with the police, but they hadn't found anything. It was like the forest had swallowed up all evidence. I couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about the creature, the missing hiker, the nest. I decided to go back to the forest. I had to find out more, had to understand what this creature was. I returned to the forest, this time with more caution. I avoided the spot where I'd camped before, instead focusing on the area around the nest. I spent days combing the area, looking for any sign of the creature, just like I had. He wrote about how he'd tried to communicate with it, how he thought it was intelligent, maybe even human-like in some ways. His last entry was chilling. He'd decided to follow the creature, to try and understand it better. That was the last he wrote. I took the journal to the police, but again, it led nowhere. At least no one told me anything about what was happening. Eventually, they told me that the case went cold, and the mystery of the creature in that forest remained unsolved. I still think about that experience, about what I saw and found. I don't know what that creature was, whether it was a Sasquatch or something else, but I do know one thing. I'm now scared to death to camp deep in the forest alone. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left alone, left to the wild. The Eastern State Penitentiary isn't a place to take lightly. I learned that firsthand. A couple of years back on Halloween night, my college buddies and I wanted to scare ourselves. Our dare was for one of us to spend a night in the penitentiary, an ancient, abandoned prison known for ghostly encounters. Studying at Penn State, I had heard many horrifying stories about this place. So why did I agree to be the one to stay? Well, mostly out of curiosity and a bit of stupid bravado. Also, I was a skeptic, always wanting proof. So I was more excited than scared, a bit naive, I guess. At twilight, my buddies dropped me off and reminded me of its notorious history. As the night grew darker, the gloom within the prison seemed to heighten, and the temperature appeared to drop lower than what I would expect for a late October evening. Wandering through this decayed prison, I thought about the legends and ghost stories I'd heard. I wondered about the intense emotions that must have been experienced by countless inmates who populated these cells. Pain, anguish, desperation, regret. Many of them had spent their final living hours within these stone and iron tombs. To distract myself, I imagined the prison in its prime, the echoes of heavy iron doors swinging open and shut, the formless murmurs of guards and prisoners. the occasional clang of metal chains, the disquieting stillness during lights out. As time passed, every echo set me on edge. I told myself the scurrying noises were just rats. Even the wind seemed to conspire, its wails morphing into tormented cries when squeezed through the narrow windows. My skin prickled, and despite wanting to dismiss it as irrational, I had a growing sensation of being watched. I kept glancing into random cells as an instinctive reaction, half expecting to see something or someone. I couldn't help but feel nervous. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep in the central hub, flashlight beside me, and a faint undertone of cheap liquor. Just then, my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows around. I began to shiver uncontrollably. The sudden drop in temperature felt out of place on a normal night. A murmur drifted to me, the words impossible to decipher, layered underneath the echo of my pounding heartbeat. The sound was distant yet eerily close, too real for my already tense mind. It was accompanied by the subtle clink and drag of what I could only imagine as heavy rusted chains. Everything felt so unreal that I was completely dazed. Jumping to my feet, I swiveled around. I pushed back my rising panic. I gasped as I noticed something, or someone, unusual. Hovering just beyond my light was a vaguely humanoid form, a sinister, wispy, almost translucent shadow. What I could see were hollow crevices where eyes should have belonged, emitting a faint glow. As the gut-wrenching realization of an actual apparition hit me, I felt an intense fear, a paralysis that stopped me from reacting. I shouted, the sound echoing in the silence, my own voice ricocheting around the stone walls. I didn't know whether to confront the entity or run, but my instinct to survive chose running, and so I took off. Stumbling through the maze-like prison, I felt talk about it. That dare still haunts me. Often I wake up at night, haunted by the sounds of that night. Let's just say that it's no surprise that none of my friends ever took up that dare for themselves. And so here I am, the only one of us who really knows what exists in those horrible, cold hallways. Okay, I really don't remember much, but I'll try to give you as many details as possible. It was just such a surreal experience that I second-guess myself on almost everything. At this point, I've probably gone over it 1,000,000 times in my head, trying to figure out if I even believe myself. I've decided that I do believe what happened, and that's why I'm passing my story on to you now. I guess here's why I think that it's actually real. I don't drink, I don't do drugs, and I don't watch scary movies. I have a strong mind, and I trust my senses. And for that reason, I really do think that what I saw was real. But it's hard to not second-guess yourself when you experience something so out of the ordinary. So my wife and I were driving back from the movies. It was really late because we'd gone to the drive-in. They don't start until the sun sets, and we stayed for the second movie, the double feature. So since we did that, we weren't on our way back home until after midnight, not even light from the night sky on that night. This had been great for the movies, but not for driving home. It was overcast, and the only real light was from our headlights. That, I believe, is why the light we saw stood out so clearly. It's really the thing that I remember the clearest. It has stood out the most in my mind as I have gone over the details of the encounter over and over in my head. We didn't see the light straight on. I actually noticed it in my rearview mirror. It was weird to see in the rearview mirror because the light was red, so I knew right away that it wasn't the headlights of another car coming up behind us. It was red and fairly small, and it also seemed very, very stationary. It sat in the lower right-hand corner of my mirror and didn't really move at all. The light was visible in the mirror for probably 2 minutes. We were just driving along, and it stayed in that lower corner the whole time. Then, when we went around a bend in the road, the light disappeared momentarily. I wondered if maybe it was an emergency vehicle or some other vehicle out of the ordinary, and we just couldn't hear its siren. But then, when we were back on a straight section of road, the light appeared again in our mirror. This time, it was bigger, which made me instantly think that whatever the light belonged to was closer to us. I thought all this was weird, but not like scary yet. It started to get scary really quickly after that. Over the course of just a few seconds, the light began to grow noticeably bigger, still in the rearview mirror. It was illuminating the warning notification that was now popping up on my mirrors, which was beginning to make me very uneasy. You know, the objects in mirror are closer than they appear, without losing control on the dark roads. She was clutching my arm in fear so hard that it hurt. I dared to quickly turn around to get a better view, and I could see it. The red orb was right behind us, probably only 10 feet from our bumper, and that's where my memory of this whole thing stops. Next thing I knew, my wife and I were sitting in our car, but we were pulled over and parked along the side of the road. We were both upright in our seats with our seatbelts on. I had both hands on the steering wheel, and the strangest thing of all, the sun was rising. I don't know what happened, but I do know that I was absolutely terrified, and so was my wife. I remember her screaming my name, begging me to drive faster. I remember how tightly I gripped the steering wheel. I remember how I could barely keep my eyes on the road ahead of me, trying to watch whatever awful thing was coming up behind me in the rearview mirror. And then nothing until we were parked looking at the sun. My wife has suggested we drove through some strange chemical field, maybe let off by a local farmer, but of course that didn't really seem plausible. But our minds were trying to come with everything. Were we so tired that we decided we couldn't drive all the way home and had pulled over to sleep? No, that didn't make sense for so many reasons, including how could we have both have had the same dream? I think that something happened that we don't remember, that whatever the red orb was, it was trying to catch us or overtake us, and I think it did catch us, and something happened that we can't remember, and that's really scary. Like I said, I have questioned this experience a lot. I've tried to figure out any logical explanation, but I can't. There is just no way my wife and I had the exact same dream. This is my first time writing it all down. Up until this point, I've just thought about it and talked about it with my wife. Now that I'm writing it down, it really seems extra real. I am 100% sure that something strange and unnatural, supernatural even, happened to us that night. We're just not sure what it was.